In nearly 2 decades as a cop, as a homicide detective, and now as a crimes against children detective, I've seen a lot and I've done a lot. This podcast is not about me, though. It's about the dedicated detectives and law enforcement leaders who every single day are doing outstanding work all across this great nation. Let's reopen some of these cases with those involved to get an inside look at their investigations. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Case Reopen podcast with Detective Scott Hodgins. You're listening to episode 004. Today, we're going to talk with a special guest out of California. Matt Hutchinson is a detective with the Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety there in the Bay Area. So I got him here with me, and let's talk to Matt. Matt, thanks for coming on today.
Thank you for having me, Scott. It's nice to be here.
Awesome. Appreciate it. Well, tell me a little bit about yourself. Where are you from? How'd you get into policing?
So I grew up in Sunnyvale and lived in the Bay Area my whole life, connected with the city that I eventually went to work with. I went away to college, came back and graduated, and knew that I wanted to do public safety and was fortunate enough to get hired and went straight into a police academy. It wasn't necessarily the plan. I know some kids always know they want to be a cop. I went to college thinking I was going to be a history teacher and quickly realized I didn't have the patience. And fortunately, my stepfather worked for the city of Sunnyvale as a public safety lieutenant. And just hearing his stories all growing up and him telling me this is the career for you pushed me in that direction. And I'm glad he did.
Yeah, that's awesome. I was kind of the same way. I went to college. If you would have told me a year before I became a police officer that I was going to become a police officer, I would have said you're crazy. But it's kind of how funny the cards fall sometimes. And here I am 18 years later, and I'm still working as a police officer. So yeah, cool. So how long have you been on with Sunnyvale?
About 17 years. Sunnyvale is a unique department. We're public safety because we do both police and fire. So got hired, went to a 27-week police academy, came out and did patrol FTO just like any other department. And then as soon as I was done with FTO, I was waiting for an EMT academy, had to take the national registry test to become an EMT, then went to, I think it was a 16-week fire academy, and then went into full fire FTO as well before I ever really kind of hit the streets and got to become my own police officer and figure out who I was going to be on the street.
Yeah. So kind of tell me, how does that work? And with a department that's a public safety, and there's I'm here broadcasting out of the Dallas-Fort Worth area. And then there's a couple of agencies that do that. But I've never been in that position. So kind of how does that work when you have that dual role?
Yeah, so Sunnyvale is what's called fully integrated public safety, which just means that you're 100% trained in both disciplines, and you have to be throughout your entire career. There might be times that you specialize, like for me, for instance, right now as a detective, I'm locked into investigations for a period of 5 years where I'm not really seeing much firework. But on patrol, you carry your turnouts in the trunk of your car, and you could get dispatched to a fire, and you're expected to get there, go code 3 like anybody else. And once you park, you change into your fire uniform and put your gun belt and your vest in the trunk of your car, go to one of the apparatus that's arriving on scene and take one of their air bottles and throw it over your shoulders. And you're a firefighter until that event is done. In the fire side, you're kind of more so dedicated to doing that activity. But there are times like our firefighters can carry concealed. If we are going to a planned event like a protest or something like that might pose a risk, we have gun lockers in our fire engines. We would bring our patrol equipment so that we'd be prepared to do both if we had to. Yeah.
So I guess, if you had a situation where both police and fire are out, and police get into something, it's nice having the fire guys there because they can start acting as police officers if necessary and be a use of force with the strength of numbers there.
For sure. And we've had firefighters on medical calls get ambushed and attacked, and they respond differently than maybe a firefighter would if they haven't been put into that situation before and they're not expecting it. So the training is definitely a benefit for sure.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. So, kind of as we were talking before, man, I'm all about the firefighters, using the tools at their disposal. If they get in something and the police aren't there yet or whatever, man, use what they got on the truck. Don't be
Yeah.
afraid to use it. So, you're not going to upset me at all. So you've been a detective for how long now?
This is my second tour in investigations. We max out at 5 years on our specialties, and we have to rotate out for a year. So I did 5 years previously, rotated out for a year, but in that year between, I was still working cold cases when I was assigned to the firehouse for the first 6 months, and then again on patrol for 6 months. Tested again and was selected to become a detective, and I'm in my fifth year of that second assignment. So I'm coming up at the end of my time here.
Okay. So as a detective, do you specialize in a certain section, whether it's homicide or child crimes or anything like that? Or do you just kind of work, general cases, whatever comes in?
Yeah, so our bureau is pretty small. We have 12 detectives. Right now, one of them's assigned to an FBI Safe Streets task force. So it's really 11 detectives in-house working a caseload for Sunnyvale. New detectives are typically assigned to what we just call general crimes. It's property crimes, fraud, elder abuse, and they get the occasional internet crimes against children referrals. And then there's persons crimes, and persons crimes is split between sex crimes and child abuse, and then robbery, homicide. My first stint through the bureau, I started in general crimes and work property cases, and then 6 months in, there was an opening in our sex crimes unit, and I jumped on that and got a lot of experience. And then 6 months after that, I was fortunate enough to get into a homicide spot. And kind of since that time, I've done a little bit of everything because I've gotten training in all realms, and I like to stay busy. So I still pick up sex cases, even though I'm assigned robbery, homicide, and I also work the cold cases for Sunnyvale.
Yeah, yeah. And so, today we're going to talk a little bit about some cold cases. And I can tell you, cold cases. The difficulty is that in a lot of agencies, these cases have been cold years before you became a detective. Some of them, many of them are years before you even became a police officer.
Or was born.
Yeah. So, and there's a reason, many of these cases went cold. And there could be, and those reasons could be many, whether it's just, they exhausted all leads at the time, or, sometimes, detectives change out and, things kind of slip through the cracks, so there could be many different reasons why a case turns cold. However, I know when I was, in homicide, we had a grant where we could work cold cases, because much of the time, you don't have time in your normal day-to-day activities to go back and work these cold cases because, let's face it, with the shortage of police officers around the country, you barely have enough time to work the active cases that you have, sitting on your desk right now. So finding time to go back and work some of these cold cases is really challenging. So we had a grant that we could work some of these cases for overtime, and much of it kind of hinged on these old cases that there may be evidence available that from a case that was around prior to DNA being being a thing,
Sure.
but even now, you take a case from 20 years ago. Yeah, DNA was around 20 years ago. However, DNA testing today far surpasses what they could do 20 years ago. So, so what maybe was tested 20 years ago was found to be inconclusive. Well, with the technology today, they might be able to go back and retest it again if they didn't exhaust it back then. But they may be able to go back and retest it today and might actually find something. And if you find something, then you might actually might be able to make a case out of it. So,
Yeah, absolutely. The instrumentation that our crime labs are using is becoming more and more sensitive every day. And it's not uncommon that we resubmit the same item multiple times and eventually you get a hit. And sometimes that can be because of the smallest, tiniest little portion of an item is where the DNA was, and they just haven't sampled the right spot yet. So in Sunnyvale, we don't have a grant. What I could say is fortunate for us is that we're a safe city where we don't have a lot of robberies and a lot of homicides. So if I'm a robbery homicide detective, I'm trying to fill that time. And I had the benefit when my first stint in the Bureau, we had a volunteer that was working cold cases. She was just a civilian, no law enforcement background, and she just had kind of a research mind and a questioning mind. She was inquisitive. And she would read these cases and just look for things that didn't make sense to her or didn't stick, or things that she thought were maybe holes in the investigation that maybe we could still go back and fix. And I'm sitting doing my general crimes thing, working burglaries, and I'm hearing her discussions with the robbery homicide detectives. And this woman was invaluable. She's finding things that we can do, and she's asking for people to do them. And eventually, when I got in that spot, one of my first things was to get in front of her and say, "Hey, Carol, what case do you have? How can I work it? Let me have one." And that's kind of how I got my start.
Yeah, yeah, and that's kind of how when I was doing it, we had a dedicated cold case detective, and in a bigger city, busier city, we had he had plenty of cases to kind of hand out and let different guys look at. And so that's kind of how I got started is, he would just say, "Hey, here's a case to look at, check it out. Let me know if you come up with anything. And we'll take it and run with it." So you've been featured in, articles in the San Francisco Chronicle, Inside Edition, all these, national and major publications, for your work on these cold cases. And at last count, I saw you solved like 8 cold cases, which is pretty awesome. Is that number still accurate now?
It's 9 now.
9. There you go. That's awesome. Which is, it's really phenomenal work because, it's,
Thank you.
Many of these cases, there's just nothing there. You look at them, there's nothing there. Everything's been done. DNA's been done. The original detectives did what they could do. There's just nothing you can do. So to have 9 different cases come across your desk, cold cases over the years, and to be able to go back and solve those cases is pretty phenomenal. So
I appreciate it. Another thing that's fortunate about Sunnyvale is that we had very early on, maybe in the mid to late 70s, our department recognized that we were losing some cases in prosecution, and the chief of police was forward thinking and said, "We need to create a CSI unit." And I don't know how common that was in the 70s. And of course, the cops didn't know that they were collecting things for DNA, but because they were evidence minded and they created that unit early, a lot of my very old cases have viable evidence where maybe some departments don't if they didn't start things so early. To speak on the articles, they're certainly flattering for people to say nice things and all that. And but the reality is, I like doing these podcasts. I'll participate in the articles because I want detectives out there to know that if you do have cold cases in your agency, don't be intimidated by them. Don't think that I'm brand new and I'm in property or I haven't been doing this long enough. I don't want to take a stab at that. You never know what task you complete on a cold case is going to solve it. So at least pick it up and read it. Be curious. If you find things that haven't been done and you do them, even if that doesn't solve the case, you've made the case better for the next detective that might pick it up coming after you. So my message is always the same in doing these types of things is I want more people working these things. These cases can be solved. They should be worked, and make the time. I know it's hard. I know we're all busy. Certainly, I know that. But make the time and try, and you'd be surprised where you get.
Yeah, very true. And you can do some of the same things that were previously done, even if it's just interviewing the same people, the same witnesses, the same involved parties, because you don't know what they might tell you that they, maybe unintentionally forgot to tell the original detectives or somebody else that looked at the case, and it might just that little thing might be what gets you to the finishing point. So you just never know. Like you said, you just never know. So
we've had witnesses whose their circumstance changes obviously over a 30-year period of time, and maybe much after the event, they're more in a place where they're willing to talk about what they know or what they don't know. And we've had witnesses come forward and break cases for us that have been talked to by the police 5 times before.
Yeah.
But it wasn't until they were in the better place in their life where they were able to give us information that we could corroborate and solve a case.
Yeah, that's very true. Very true. It could be like a domestic situation or something like that where
Absolutely.
they know something, but I mean, they can't tell on their husband or their boyfriend or something like that. But 20, 30, 40 years later, completely different situation. They've matured. They've long been out of a relationship with that person, and they might have some answers for questions that you've always had regarding the case. So you just never know.
100%.
So, all right. Well, let's talk about a case back in 1979. You guys in Sunnyvale worked a case. Kind of tell me about it.
So in October of 1979, Sunnyvale officers responded out to a commercial area of our town. It's not a residential neighborhood by any means. It's like manufacturing and office buildings, not really even storefronts. So there's not really like major traffic that goes through that area or reasons for people to be in that area. But we responded out for a report of a female security guard named Estela Mena, who was stabbed multiple times, and she was dying in the lobby of the building that she was contracted to protect. She was found kind of concealed behind a row of vending machines by an employee who was working upstairs in the building. He came down at the end of the day and heard sounds of somebody struggling to breathe, and went over to the vending machines and found Estela. She was on her stomach, with her pants and her underwear pulled down about mid-leg, and had been obviously stabbed multiple times in the torso. He ran to her desk to call 911, but for whatever reason, that phone doesn't make outbound calls outside their business complex. And so he had to go back up to his desk to call 911. And by the time he did that and came back, she had flipped over on her back. Her pants had been pulled up, and she was dying.
Yeah.
Ultimately, she died from multiple stab wounds, and the investigation kind of stalled out pretty quickly.
Yeah, before cameras, before DNA was the thing. So you kind of, where do you start on something like that?
Yeah, so you're exactly right. No cameras, no social media, none of that type of stuff where you could kind of dig into somebody's past. So they started with her kind of circle, her family, her friends, her social circle, the things that she went and did. And they kind of quickly realized that she had a pretty tight social circle. She was young. She was only 18 years old, still a high school student, but working as a security guard. She had limited friends. She wasn't the type to go out and be adventurous or risky behaviors or anything like that. There was no information learned from family or friends about a boyfriend or anybody that we might center an investigation on from the early get-go. It was really what we call the whodunit, and it was a mystery of who could have done this thing. The one piece of evidence that they focused on very early was a smear of blood on a door frame inside the lobby where she was killed. But obviously in 1979, they weren't testing for DNA. They were just blood typing. And that was the extent of what they had at that time. The other thing they did was they looked for known offenders that were committing sex crimes or burglaries in the area, just based on cases that had been closed by Sunnyvale. And that led to a dead end as well. It wasn't until DNA became more popular in the 90s and then early 2000s that blood stain on the door frame was tested, and it came back with a full male profile that was entered into CODIS. But unfortunately, there was no matches in CODIS for years and years and years. And then when I took on the case in 2018 or so, 2019, 2018, there still had been no match in CODIS.
Yeah. So, and obviously, just to back up a little bit, just kind of think about the crime scene, the way it looks. There's blood on the door frame. The victim is obviously, I believe at the time she was still alive, but she was pretty immobile at that point, and she was she died upon transport or arrival at the hospital. But if there's, the blood that was found, I'm assuming kind of away from the body a little bit, indicating that, your first indication is that, well, that's not her blood, because how would her blood gotten over here? So, that's suspect blood. But like you said, how do you find that suspect based on the blood in 1979, other than just getting lucky with blood types and finding a suspect and trying to match it up that way, which is kind of circumstantial, if you will, but it's not as definitive as DNA technology is today.
Right. So you're right in your assessment that the blood was not right next to her body. They were able to quickly learn that it wasn't from her, most likely. It was a very small amount. The scene photos in these old cases, in my experience, are not always the best. The quality of the film wasn't always that great. How they were developed, maybe
they were even using Polaroids back then, so just not the best. Right. Photo technology.
It's not a digital world back then like we have today, where we can zoom in and get a great image. So the blood was farther away from her. It was a very small amount, but it was the only real evidence that we had to go off of. So when I took on the case and I realized that CODIS wasn't hitting for us, we did familial searching through California Department of Justice, where they can look for first-degree relatives like parents or siblings. Still struck out. And unfortunately for me, Santa Clara County, the county that I work within, has a district attorney's office that maintains a cold case unit. And they've applied for a grant to allow them to do DNA work that's expensive, and that included genealogy in this case.
Yeah.
So we were able to send the blood stain to a genealogical lab and have it developed and developed into a profile that we could look for relatives with.
Yeah. And how long did this kind of take, this process?
The genealogy process, it kind of varies. I think I think the labs kind of work like an emergency room. It's kind of first come, first serve. So I think there's times where they're busier and times where they're not.
Yeah.
But the biggest thing that can slow these things down is how close are the matches that you get. There's limited databases that law enforcement's able to get into. I know people in the public worry about Big Brother knowing everything about their DNA, and the cops are going to get into Ancestry.com and 23andMe and they're going to find my relatives. That's not what's happening. We don't have access to databases like those.
Yeah.
The example I always give, Scott, is if you and I were long lost cousins and we were trying to find each other, and you took an Ancestry test and I took a 23andMe test, those two companies don't communicate. It's not like they share data and they're trying to match, because they want you to buy their test.
Yeah, they're competitive companies.
There's a database called GEDmatch. I know it changed names. I'm losing it off the top of my head, but originally it was called GEDmatch. And essentially what it was somebody who's smart in computers and knows how to program said, all these people of these different companies own their data. They should be able to upload them to a site that translates them all to speak to one another. And for a while, it was the wild, wild west. It was, hey, if you're going to put your DNA in here, you might match with law enforcement. Now people check in a box affirmatively consenting to matching with law enforcement. But like that's an example of one of those smaller databases for genealogical matches that we can get. Yeah. And when I say that, depending on how close your matches are, kind of determines how long all this work takes, is I've had cases where we do that genealogy work and we get back third cousins, and that's pretty distant. And I can't name any of my third cousins. Yeah. And then I've had cases where we put it in and we get first cousins back. If I'm starting from a first cousin, that investigation is going to get moving pretty fast, because
you can narrow that down.
We can identify those relationships a lot easier.
Yeah.
Specifically in this murder of Estela Mena, we got fairly close matches back when we did the genealogy originally. And we were able to use that to pretty quickly identify who we thought was the source of the blood.
That's awesome. Yeah. And some of the point of it is, it's not like TV. It's not like TV shows where, you submit whatever evidence you have, and within 30 minutes, or you go to lunch and you come back from lunch and there's your answers right there waiting for you. And and boom, you got the case solved right then and there. These things take
No,
time, and they can take months or even years to get some of these answers back.
Yeah, even best case scenario, if you get the results back from the lab quickly and you get close matches, you're still talking 4 to 6 months
Yeah.
before you know where you're going next. And I've had a genealogy case that I worked for 5 years.
Yeah.
And to speak to investigators that are listening to this, don't give up just because it takes a long time. Keep going.
Yeah.
And if you rotate out of your assignment, hand it off to somebody else and tell them exactly where they're at, and make sure it keeps going, because the answer is out there if you're willing to keep following it for long enough.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. So, okay. So what happened with Estella?
So we had a pretty good idea of who the source of the blood on the door was, but now you have to go out and get a reference sample from him. I've utilized trash runs a lot, because when a trash can gets put out on the curb in California, it's considered discarded property, and there's no longer an expectation of privacy over it. Essentially, the logic behind that is if anybody walking up the street could look in your can, why can't the police? And so this gentleman who we thought was the source lived in Southern California. I came up with a plan, knew which day his trash would go out, and contacted my department and said, hey, you got to fly me down to Southern California. I'm going to go to his house really early in the morning and collect items that I think might have DNA and fly him back and send them to our lab.
Yeah.
And they said yes, and they paid for it and sent me out there. 3 o'clock in the morning, I get to his house and there's no can. 4 o'clock in the morning, come back, there's no can. And I'm thinking, is this the type of guy who just forgot last night, or is he out of town, or what's happening? So we went back each hour up until the point where we had to catch our flight, and the can never went out. So I contacted a detective that I was working with at that agency, and I said, hey, would you mind just sitting down the street and watching his house and see if maybe he's the type of guy that walks the can out like right as the trash truck is pulling through his neighborhood because he forgets, or maybe that's part of his pattern of trying to protect evidence. I don't know.
Yeah.
And sure enough, the trash truck goes through his neighborhood at like 11 or 12 o'clock during the day, and he walks his cans out maybe 30 minutes before. So at that point, we have to get a little bit creative. How am I going to get his DNA without him knowing?
Yeah.
I could get a search warrant with the facts that I have, and I could put a swab inside of his cheek and get a sample, but that carries some risk, because what if he disappears? What if he is the guy and we've lost our element of surprise and evidence grows legs and goes away, or we can't solve it because we weren't careful about how we went about the investigation. So then I contacted
trash man for the day.
I'm sorry?
Did one of your guys end up playing trash man for the day?
I did.
Yeah, there you go. Yes.
So I contacted the trash company and got them to authorize me to be the trash man. They were great. I mean, it's not popular to help law enforcement, so they've asked me not to share their name with the company.
Yeah. But they're usually pretty helpful behind the scenes. Yeah,
absolutely. It's unfortunately the times are such right now, and public sentiment sometimes, or at least in what's projected in the media, I know that's not true of everybody, is be careful about helping cops, but they were great. And they gave me a trash truck for the day, and we showed up the morning that we knew we needed to go out there with the driver that was going to be on that route, and said, all right, let me take a look at your truck. And he opens it up, and it's full like 3 inches of just sludge, just disgusting. And I look at him and I say, guys, there's no way that we can pick items of evidence out of that and have any kind of certainty that they came from him or that they're going to be not contaminated. So they cleaned the truck out for us. And then I said, okay, tell me how the compactor works. And they said, well, as soon as the can dumps in the top, the compactor automatically smashes it all to the back of the truck. So we need to stop that, because it's going to destroy the evidence. It's going to smash it all over this dirty truck. So they were able to get some of their engineers that work for or the mechanics that work for the company to disable the compactor arm, but it was still gross. I mean, trash trucks are nasty. If you've never been on one, I don't recommend it. I'm grateful for them doing the work that they do, but they said, hey, there's a Home Depot down the road. If you want to go get a big tarp, you're welcome to go do that. So we shot down the road to Home Depot as quick as we could and got a tarp and some zip ties and some bungee cords and climbed up in there and rigged it up as best we could to basically make a catch basin for all that trash.
Yeah.
So we thought we were in good shape, and we drove out to the house, and I told the trash collector, I said, okay, dump his can in there like normal, because he's got a camera above his driveway. We don't want to let on that we're doing something different. And then I need you to make it look like your truck broke down. So he dumps the suspect's can into his truck, and then he manipulated the arm of the truck to make it look like it was malfunctioning, to the point where he got out of the car and got on his cell phone pretending to call back to home base and say, hey, truck 48 is down again, boss. You're going to have to send somebody else through this neighborhood. And we drove back with it, back to the police department, and sorted through it. And we were very fortunate. We found a number of items that had the suspect's DNA on it, and it was a 1-to-1 match to the blood on the door frame.
That's awesome.
It was. There's twists and turns in these cold cases, though, and it wasn't the end of that story. Obviously, I'm working with the district attorney's office, and they're looking at it saying, okay, that's great. There's blood in there. Who does it belong to, and what's his connection to the business? So what the detectives in 1979 did that was awesome for me, it was they cataloged every single employee who had access to that building. And there were quite a lot, because it was a large company. But on top of that, they were moving buildings. So they had a temporary agency in there. They had a moving company in there. And then they had all the security guards. All told, there were about 200 people who had access to the building at different times. And the source of the blood on the door frame ended up being a mailroom employee of the business. Doesn't mean he didn't do it, but what we learned is that he was going to have a reasonable explanation for being at the location. And that was something that we needed to try to defeat as a possible defense if we could.
Yeah. He's got a right to
be
there.
So then I took the crime scene photos to our crime lab, and I sat down with them, and we went through every single item of evidence and every single photo. And we talked about how viable they were for testing. You remember I said that Estella was stuffed kind of behind a row of vending machines? Well, most of her injuries were to her front torso. There was one kind of lower on her abdomen, but most of them were in the front. And in that row of vending machines, behind what would have been where her head was one of her shoes. It was still tied, but it was behind her head. As a detective looking at cold cases, you have to be able to look at photos from a scene that you never got to go to and never got to see in person, and kind of look at them logically and try to figure out, how the heck did that shoe get above where her head would have been if she's lying on her back being stabbed?
Yeah.
And it's important to know about your victim when you look at those photos. And Estella was trained in martial arts. She would compete in martial arts. So it's always been my belief that she did everything that she could to possibly defend herself during this attack. And it makes a lot of logical sense that if she's on her back being stabbed and she's got nowhere to go because of the vending machines on her sides, she's kicking up with her heel, trying to kick the suspect. And that could have been when the shoe flipped off behind her head. So and this again goes back to the cold case volunteer, Carol. Mm-hmm. For years, she advocated for that shoe to be tested, and she was right. We tested that shoe, and suspect blood came back on the shoe.
Wow.
So now the first question I have is it the same guy that's on the door frame? Mm-hmm. Because now that's much more compelling that there's blood that's on her body, or what would have been her body, than there is on a door frame 30 feet away from her.
It's one thing to for somebody to give a good alibi for the door frame, but it's a whole nother thing if your blood's on the body, basically.
Exactly. And the twist and turn of this one is that it's a completely different male. And this male was a gentleman named Samuel Silva, who had a significant criminal history out of the state of Colorado. We weren't able to establish any kind of link between him and the mailroom employee who we identified on the door frame. But Samuel Silva had everything in his history that you would expect based on what we know about the crime of Estella's murder. He had rape history, he had weapons history, had done stabbings before. He had shot and killed his stepfather. It was ruled a justifiable homicide because the statement was that he was defending his mom in a domestic violence incident. But what was important from that case is we learned he had been living with his brothers in Sunnyvale at the time of my murder. So we can put him in Sunnyvale. We can put him in my crime scene on my victim, and he's got this criminal history. But on top of that, we're also able to look into his probation report from that original case. And it talked about his job that he was working when he lived in Sunnyvale with his brothers. And he worked at the same location that our victim did before she became a security guard. She worked at an amusement park close by to Sunnyvale. And so now we can put him crossing paths with our victim as well. We still weren't done at that point. Now we've got two kind of conflicting theories. So we tested more items. You remember I said that the victim's pants had been pulled down and then had been pulled back up when the witness came down and found her. Well, I wanted the hem of the pants right where somebody would have touched to be tested for DNA. And sure enough, that DNA came back to Samuel Silva as well. In my opinion, well, what I should tell you about Samuel Silva is that he was dead by the time we learned who he was and his connection to this case. But what I was going to say is that in my opinion, even if you identify a suspect and he's dead, you still ought to do everything you can to
bring
present
closure
a case
to the
that's
case.
provable in court.
Yeah.
Because as a family, they're going to have a ton of questions and they deserve every answer you can possibly give them. So what we did is we went back out to Southern California and we served that gentleman with a search warrant for DNA, for fingerprints, for his entire house to look for possible evidence related to the murder, and found nothing. He was completely cooperative. He wasn't rattled at all. There was no connection between him and Samuel Silva. And ultimately, I don't believe that he was involved in any way. As a mailroom employee, he told me that he would cut open boxes and deliver packages to every single building. It's possible he had a small amount of blood on his hand, touching a door frame.
Just
but Samuel Silva is the suspect in this murder, and we were able to prove that. And even with him dead, we still wanted to get more evidence if we could. And we flew out to Colorado and interviewed every surviving family member, every former cellmate that he ever had. And basically the circumstances of the statements that they were able to give us all helped corroborate that he was the person who killed Estella Mena.
Yeah. Yeah. Did he ever tell anybody or give any statements or anything like that?
He bragged kind of in general terms about crimes that he had committed, but not specifically naming her or naming the location where it happened.
Yeah.
But enough that it was credible to believe that he had committed other murders.
Yeah. Yeah. Wow. That's pretty awesome that, y'all did all that work and jumped through all those hoops and defeated all those hurdles to get that one solved. And like you said, if nothing else, it helps the family get some closure on their case and get some answers that they've never had. And so it's awesome y'all were able to do that. And then real quick, I want to, there's another case I want to talk about real quick, and we don't have a whole lot of time left. But y'all worked a separate, or your agency worked a separate homicide back in 1969. Is that correct? Yeah.
I'll try to be brief for time. In 1969, a couple of cops were working graveyards, and they're window to window, as cops do sometimes on nights. And they're just kind of shooting the breeze and talking about the shift, and they shine their spotlight off in the distance, and it's to the entrance of the Sunnyvale dump, and they realize that there's a body on the ground. A young woman named Susan De Leon, who was, I believe, 20 years old at the time of her murder. She was a college student at a nearby junior college. She would walk from Sunnyvale, where she lived, to the junior college and then walk home after her classes. And she never made it home that night, obviously, because she was abducted and strangled and left at our dump. Her purse had been found in a neighboring city called Mountain View behind a school, with the contents kind of thrown in the field behind the school. And kind of the same story as Estella. She had a very limited social circle, didn't have boyfriends. She spent time with family. She worked as a babysitter, and she went to school. So same thing as with Estella. The investigators stuck with her close-knit circle. They talked to the family that she babysat for. And they talked to her friends and really got no leads. There was no DNA. Evidence wasn't preserved all that great. Sunnyvale had a problem with some mice in our property room at one point, and some items were destroyed. But they really got nothing until 2004. A woman called the police department saying that she might have information about the homicide, and then followed up with a letter as well. And in her letter, She said essentially, I don't know what you can do with this information or if it's even credible, but you should know that the victim was pregnant when she was killed, and you should do everything you can to look at my husband, Charles Dexter Main. So when I get that information, I go, great. Did somebody in 2004 follow up on this letter? And unfortunately, the answer was no. The detectives that got the letter in 2004 looked at the case and saw that Charles Main had been interviewed back in 1969. He was the father of the family that Susan babysat for, and he gave an alibi that night. He said that the night of the homicide, he was in a real estate lecture at a separate college campus that's nearby with his wife, and he gave her name, and it was just accepted as his alibi.
Never checked out.
The report indicated that it was checked out, but the degree in which it was checked out was not really clear. Did they go and talk to the professor? Was there a sign-in sheet? Like, how did they know that he was there?
Or they just asked the wife, and she's on her husband's behalf. Oh yeah, he was with me. Yeah.
Well, the other thing that's interesting is if you look closely at the alibi, the name for his wife that he gave was not his wife. She was not. That's not the woman that was married to him at the time. That later sent us the letter in 2004. So that's the first element to the alibi that would make you question its veracity and how true it is.
Yeah.
The other thing is he's Charles Dexter Main Jr. and the name that he gave for the wife was his sister. So in my mind, it's logical to believe it's possible that they checked the roster for the class and it could have been his father and his sister that were attending it. At that point, we really didn't know. The other thing that was about the letter that jumped out at me was that the victim was pregnant. That wasn't in any police report that I had ever read associated with the case. It wasn't a statement that was given by any friends or family. We were told that she didn't have a boyfriend. So where did that information come from? And the only place that I could look to try to prove it was the victim's autopsy. Mm-hmm. And the medical examiner listed her as newly porous with an intact mucus plug. I was not a father at the time that I read that case, so I wasn't familiar with pregnancy.
Yeah.
I now know what a mucus plug is, and I know that it's something that happens with a woman's body during pregnancy. And I also had to look up the term newly porous, and I learned that she was pregnant. So now there's a woman in 2004 who sends us a letter that knows the victim's pregnant. Presumably the victim knows she's pregnant. And the doctor who examined her dead body knows that she's pregnant, but nobody else in the world knows this. Yeah. It makes me really question how this woman knew this information. And I didn't get this until 2011, 2012, and realized that number one, the alibi is questionable at best. And number two, this woman has information that very few people actually know. I started by calling her and getting a feel for how credible she was. And she was immediately surprised that it had taken so long to call her. And one of the things I said, the two main questions I have was, how did you know she was pregnant? And she immediately answered, because my husband's the one that got her pregnant and he told me. And the other question was, why did you send us the letter? And her answer was, because my husband killed that little girl and you guys need to investigate it. So it's like a hair standing up, chills type of moment as an investigator where somebody's finally coming forward and telling you that they know about your murder. Yeah. We need to do everything we can to try to get face to face with her and get a statement and see what we can do to prove this.
Yeah. And now you got a motive too.
Now we got a motive. And if you look at things closely, you remember I said that the victim's purse with all her belongings were strewn about in a field behind an elementary school in Mountain View. What I didn't tell you off the bat was that house that backed up to that field was Charles Main's home. Mm-hmm. So it makes a lot of sense that he threw it over his fence into that field.
Yes.
So the next thing I got to do is I have to sell my department on sending me to Oregon where this family lived. Not Charles, they're estranged now, but where the ex-wife lived and her children lived. And I sat down with her at a small police department in Albany, Oregon, and she told me the story. And she said, look, my husband got this girl pregnant while we were married. It was the girl who used to babysit our other children. He eventually told me that he couldn't have us both at the same time and he wasn't going to have another kid and he had to get rid of Susan, and he killed her. He strangled her, borrowed his dad's van, drove her up to the Sunnyvale dump, and left her at the entrance. All information that wasn't provided publicly. I mean, there was some that was provided publicly, like the location where her body was found, but not that we suspected she was transported in a car, how she would have gotten there, or the cause of death, or any of that type of stuff.
She was able to corroborate some of that evidence that only somebody who's familiar with the crime would know.
Absolutely. And so we also get from the ex-wife a lot of his history, and his history is violence, strangulation against his ex-wife. Another ex-wife, we were able to find a strangulation case with her. In addition to that, he in a domestic violence incident one night, he put a gun in her mouth and called all the kids out to the living room and said, "Watch me shoot your mom in the head." Just not a great guy.
Yeah.
And now it became, okay, this all sounds credible. Let's get in front of these different kids now too. We talked with his daughters that lived in Oregon. One was pretty uncooperative. Understandably so. I mean, we're investigating her dad for a murder, and she is loyal to her dad. I get it.
Yeah.
But the reason we know that she was uncooperative is the interview rooms were set up as such that before you would go in, there was a monitor on the outside of the door that was a live feed to what was happening inside the room. And she was talking to herself, saying things like, "I'm not going to tell them anything. They want me to say bad things about my dad, and I'm not going to do it."
Yeah.
Which was interesting to me going in, knowing I was having an adversarial conversation right off the bat.
Yeah. Yeah.
The second daughter that we went to speak with, her name was actually Susan, and very strange. She was born after the murder. We sat down with her. I told her where I was from. And as soon as I said, "I'm Detective Hutchison from the city of Sunnyvale," she began crying. And I sat with it and I let it play out. And when she kind of composed herself, I said, why are you so upset when I tell you my name and where I'm from? And the first thing out of her mouth was, "You're here to talk to me about the babysitter that my dad killed." I said, "Tell me about that." And she said that she was named after the babysitter because her dad felt guilty, and that he confessed to the murder to her when she turned 21. They were drinking together and hanging out in the hot tub, and he bragged to her that he had murdered the babysitter because he got her pregnant and couldn't have a pregnant girlfriend when he was married to this witness's mom.
Wow.
And so it's all starting to come together that Mr. Charles Dexter Main Jr. is the suspect in this case. And to save time, I'll tell you that we did a couple of pretext phone calls. I don't know if you guys do those in Texas, but we had the ex-wife and the cooperative daughter both call our suspect on the phone on a recorded line and try to prompt him to give statements about the murder. We asked them to say to him basically, "Hey, there's a cop from Sunnyvale who won't go away. He keeps calling me saying he wants to talk about this case. What should I say?" And he gave them instructions like, "Hey, don't tell him anything. You don't know anything. You don't remember anything. You don't want an old man to die in prison," stuff like that. To kind of save time, I'll try to wrap things up for you. What we got to a point where we had probable cause to serve a search warrant on his house, which to serve a search warrant on a murder from 1969, nearly 50 years later, is a tall task, but we were able to do it. And during that search warrant, we found a tape, a reel-to-reel recording tape in a box. And on the outside of the box, it says, "Do not destroy. This is from the night Sue was killed." In addition to that, we found a parking permit for the junior college where the victim had been abducted and later was found dead at the dump. But there was no record of Mr. Main being a student at the junior college, so no reason for him to have a parking permit for that semester at the college. I did a full interview with him for a few hours that day. He didn't admit to the homicide. When I asked him, "Why did you keep a tape for 50 years?" with that note on it, his quote was, "In case you ever caught me." I asked him, you mentioned this real estate lecture in 1969, but you didn't tell the cops that you had a tape. Why didn't you tell them you had a tape? And there was no explanation for it. A lot of circumstantial stuff. We took that case to the district attorney's office, and they looked at it. And unfortunately, Mr. Main was dying of COPD at the time. He was on home oxygen and had very limited mobility. And the decision was made that, yes, you've proven the case. He is the suspect, but we're not able to prosecute him because he won't make it through a trial.
Yeah. Yeah.
So at that point, I took one more run at him. I went out to he was now living in a care home. I went out to him at his care home and pushed him again. I used a ruse for your listeners that aren't in law enforcement. Cops are allowed to lie in their investigations as long as it doesn't become coercive. I presented him with a DNA report that said that his DNA was on the victim's dress up near her neck. And his original explanation was that he hadn't seen the victim in a month or so before the homicide. And then when I presented him with that ruse, he said he saw her the night of the homicide and must have given her a hug. And that's why his DNA was on her dress. So it all came together that Charles was the suspect. It hurts to not be able to prosecute him, but we were able to present the case much like I just did to you here, but in more detail to the family and give them the satisfaction of having answers and knowing that he was the person responsible. And ultimately he passed away a short time after the case was solved and the family was notified.
Yeah. Yeah. And like you said, the prosecution is one part of it, but at least, the case is solved. The family gets the answers they've been looking for. Kind of same thing as the last case. They get those answers they've long wanted. Yeah, it would have been awesome to be able to prosecute the guy, but at least you know who did it, and the family knows who did it, and they can get that closure they need. So,
absolutely.
Awesome, Matt. Well, man, I really do appreciate you coming on today and talking to us.
Thank you.
Man, you're doing some badass things out there. You're doing a great job. Keep up the great work. I'd love to have you back on later on. Let's talk some more cold cases, and we'll get you back on soon.
That sounds great. Thank you for having me. If I could just say to any detectives out there, I'll tell you again, don't be intimidated by these cases. Pick them up, read them, be curious, look for things that weren't done. Just keep a running list on the side as you're reading it, and perform tasks. Think about it like a football team moving the ball down the field. Just keep moving the ball, and you don't know what's going to eventually break it. But these families are waiting for answers, and we ought to be doing everything we can to give them.
Awesome. Thanks again, Matt. We'll talk soon. Be safe.
Take care, Scott. Same to you.
All right, buddy. And that's a wrap on episode 004 of the Case Reopened podcast with Detective Scott Hodgins. Thanks for tuning in, and we will see you on the next one.